many more socialists and closet communists running the economy today. And we have guys like Donald Trump, who is pretty hardcore capitalist. And again, Kim and I are not Republican or Democrat. We want to provoke thinking and thought and upset many of you. But that's when your ideas will come up. So what I see it today, as Donald Trump said, again, he's a friend of mine, not Republican or Democrat. He says he's never been in a place with more hate, where people actually hate each other, than Washington, D.C. And so when you look at what's happening all throughout the world, hate is rampant. Like I just read the New York Times about what's going on in France with Marine Le Pen and the other, she's running against a Goldman, not a Goldman guy, but a Rothschild banking guy. And there's hate there. There's actual hate that whole economies or whole civilizations and cultures are coming apart over hate. And these are people who hate friends and neighbors. I mean, after Trump got elected, it was really difficult to talk to people because you either loved them or you hated them. There was very few open-mindedness in the middle. So today's program, especially for those of you who would like to stand on the three sides of, all coins have three sides, heads, tails, and the edge. We're going to stand on the edge today and find out kind of what's going on, but can capitalism save us from annihilation or collapse of economy, possibly? Any comments, Kim?
Well, I'm looking forward to today's show because, Robert, you talk about sometimes you have to look backwards in order to connect the dots going forward. And our two guests are going to do exactly that. They're going to talk about the history of American capitalism, of American business, and then we're going to talk about the future of American business and capitalism. So
that's not just American. We're going to get
well,
off
it's
this.
global. True, it is global, absolutely. And so if you're in business, if you have anything to do with business, this is your program, and I think we all have something to do with business.
And regardless if you're a Trump fan or an Obama fan or a Clinton or Bernie Sanders fan, our job today is to disturb you so that you start thinking interesting thoughts. So our special guest today is Benjamin Waterhouse. He's a historian of American politics and of business and of capitalism. His latest book is The Land of Enterprise, A Business History of the United States. And he's also Lobbying in America, The Politics of Business from Nixon to NAFTA, Politics and Society in Modern America. Simply said, the question is, how come the rich are getting so rich and everybody else is eating lunch? So with that, I'm very happy to introduce a highly intelligent man who has spent his life studying the subject of capitalism, education, and politics and all this. So welcome to the program, Mr. Is it Dr. Waterhouse?
That's fine, but, Ben's good too.
Ben will too. Okay.
Welcome, Ben.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here.
So what do you think is happening, from a macro level, let's say, not only in the U.S. but in the world, this thing about there is so much hate and animosity within countries like France, United States, and England with Brexit and all this?
Well, I think one way that we can try to think about modern politics is from the perspective of changes in the economy and changes in capitalism. And really what I'm trying to do with this book, The Land of Enterprise, that you mentioned, is sort of give us the long view of how some of these critical debates developed over time. And really my goal with this is to suggest that there are lessons in the past about really fundamental divides, not only between business and sort of its antagonists, but even within the business community, that if we can sort of wrap our heads around the way these fights have played out in the past, we may have at least some indication of where we can take a more maybe fruitful direction in the present and into the future.
So let me say that I apologize. I just got your book 2 days ago, but what I did pick up from it is, in a very oversimplistic point of view, when Americans left Europe and came to America, they were coming for capitalism, basically, and they were leaving a monarchy or a feudal system, basically, and they moved to a capitalist system, and America blossomed because it was about so-called free enterprise and capitalism. Is that oversimplifying it? Or?
Well, I think that's a common story, and I think there's a way we might make it a little bit more complicated and a little more accurate, and that's to say that the period of European colonization and settlement in the New World coincided with the development of capitalism coming out of Western Europe, and it wasn't that it sort of proceeded in America on its own, but rather as part of a bigger Atlantic economy that really stretched from the textile factories in England to the cotton fields of the American South, to the trade that crisscrossed the Atlantic from Africa to South America and so on.
So if you could summarize it, because that's why you're the guest on this program, what do you think is going on, and what do you want people to take away from your book, The Land of Enterprise?
Well, I think, we often think about political and economic problems in a really binary way, particularly when we talk about today's problems. We talk, on one hand about this very pro-business, free enterprise at all costs. The other side is socialism kind of side, and then the other side, you have this very skeptical, very critical perspective that sees everything in the business world as the enemy of the people. And I think we can gain a lot by recognizing that being pro or anti-business doesn't really make any more sense than being pro or anti-government. We have it. The question is, what can we do with it, and how can we make the best decisions for the greatest number?
So the pro and anti-capitalism, has that been going on forever? Is that the same argument that's been going on in the past that's going on today?
Well, I think it actually is a lot more. It's a lot more muted today in many ways. The anti-capitalism, such that it is in America, is really a call to sort of rein in some of the excesses or regulate some of the extremes. There aren't very many people, at least the way I see it today, who are actively, maybe, I'm sure there are people who are saying this, but they're not very prominent, calling to kind of totally upset the apple cart and, abolish private property and nationalize industries. And on the other hand, 100 years ago, you heard that stuff all the time. There was a very powerful, radical strain within union organizing, within socialist politics in 1900, 1910, that very much called to overturn the whole thing. And I think one of the historical consequences of the 20th century was a sort of move toward the middle on that level.
So once again, our guest today is Benjamin Waterhouse. Call him Ben. He's a historian of American politics, business, and capitalism. He is the author of just-released book, The Land of Enterprise, A Business History of the United States. And his other book is Lobbying America, the Politics of Business from Nixon to NAFTA. And that's a very important period, is because it was President Nixon who took the dollar off the gold standard in 1971, and it created one of the biggest economic booms in history, but that boom ended around the year 2000. So now we have this mess, and that's not just the U.S., it's all over the world. And that's why Rich Dad, Poor Dad was written in 1997. As I said, the rich don't work for money. And the reason I say that is because there is the investor class and there is the working class. And the working class who are working for money, going to school, saving money, investing in the stock market, they're getting crucified today because they don't realize there's a new aristocrat out there called the investor class. And, Kim and I are in the investor class more than the working class. And just for your information, Benjamin, the reason is because both our fathers got fired mid-career. And that kind of set us up to say, well, maybe I'm not going to let any company take care of me like our dads did. And we're going to take care of ourselves. So what happened when both dads got fired was that Kim and I both became entrepreneurs. We're not going to be dependent upon anybody else. So that's why we become capitalists. And, capitalists are people who employ money, wealth, and people. That's what we do. Any comments?
Yeah, well, that brings up the question, and this is our whole bent, and I'd like Ben's opinion on it, is that why do we not teach financial education in our school system today? Why is that, Ben?
Well, you're not the first to ask that question. And in fact, there have been, particularly, since, say, World War II or so, since the period of the New Deal, there's been a real loud cry for teaching what you're calling financial education, and often it's called economic education. And it's been sort of a cornerstone of a political movement based on the sort of defense of free enterprise. And I think, there's a lot of reasons that it hasn't caught on. I think, on a simple level, I think teachers themselves have a hard time getting students to grasp something that is sort of inherently foreign to them, really, no matter what class environment a student is coming from. They're not going to be doing their own taxes. They're not going to be making their own investment decisions. And so there are teachers who try, I think, to model some of those things, but it's always very abstract, and it cuts away. But I think there's also a political angle to it as well.
And what is
that?
that?
I think that the notion of teaching financial education has often been caught up with teaching a specific view of the economy that sort of coincides with a fairly traditional conservative anti-statist, anti-government policy. And many of the people who are in the education fields, both as teachers and as administrators and curriculum designers, kind of push back against that.
Right, because most of them aren't capitalists. Because my father was a PhD, head of education for the state of Hawaii, graduate of Stanford, Northwestern University of Chicago. He knew nothing about money, zero. And that's why I had to turn to my rich dad, who was an entrepreneur, a man who never went to school, but he was, I would say, a genius when it comes to capitalism. He understood it. So the paradox between rich dad and poor dad, I think, is one of the reasons you see teachers can't teach what they don't know. So when I step back and I look at Bernanke, a PhD from Princeton, and Yellen, a PhD from Berkeley, I'm going, what the heck do they know about money? They're both employees, they're government employees. How can they teach what they don't know? That'd be like me when I was in flight school. My instructors all could fly, but when I went to regular school, most of my teachers, had no idea what money was. So that's the reason I asked that question.
Yeah. And I think it's a good one. And one of the things that I try to do in this book is to try to weave a story that intersects history as it's often taught with the history of business itself. And it's not a how-to book on becoming a successful investor, but it is a discussion of how the prerogatives of businesses and the interests of different types of industries have shaped things in America.
Podcasts are archived at richdadradio.com. And the reason we archive them is because we think they're worth listening to again and again, because repetition is how we learn. That's why I read several books 2 or 3 times, because the first time I read it, I didn't get much. Second time more, third time even better. So this is especially true today for this program because of the warfare between those who've supported Hillary and those who supported Trump. There does seem to be this hatred all across the world, not just in the United States. And I really do think it's, in oversimplistic term, is the battle between the rich and the poor, and then the working class in between here. So today our special guest is Benjamin Waterhouse. I want to encourage everybody to read his book, The Land of Enterprise, because like it or not, whether you're a communist who believes the government should take care of everybody, or you're a capitalist, you believe that you should be allowed to make as much money as you want, in between all that is enterprise. In between there is business. The people that bring you food, water, shelter, Listerine, all these things in there is what's really is in between the battle between the ultra-rich and the poor right now. And this battle is all over the world. And as most of you know, Rich Dad stands for the ultra-rich. I'd rather understand why the rich are getting so much richer. And I catch a lot of flack from friends and family who are on the other side. Right, Kim?
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. So I'm interested to hear from Ben on this point because in perusing your book, it seems like a lot of the issues and problems business faces today, even on a global scale, those were the same to maybe various degrees, but the same issues that they were facing many, many years ago. So back to the original question on income inequality. Is that a natural evolution of capitalism? The rich, the poor?
I think if you look at it historically and you see capitalism as a system that has not existed sort of in a pure form throughout all of human history, but rather came into being in the sort of modern period that also coincides with the history of the United States, you can say that broadly, yes. the tendency of capital is to accrue to the top, and the left to its own devices, wealth creates more wealth. Now, in American history, that's not always been the reality. The fact is that, through much of the first half of the 1900s, the 20th century, there was a bit of a contraction, particularly between, say, the 1930s and the 1960s or so. Income inequality wasn't increasing; it was decreasing. And since the 1970s, it's been increasing.
Is that because of technology?
Well, it's a combination of things, and I think technology plays a role. I think policy is probably a bigger function.
Plus, Nixon taking us off the gold standard, which allowed the government to print as much money as it wanted.
There is more money to be had, and there's certainly the deregulation of financial markets, of which the gold standard was part of it, but not the only thing, has created many more opportunities for investment. And the nature of investment is that the people with the money make more money, and the people who can borrow money to invest do even better.
Oh, that's music to my ears, as you know here. Anyway, so Ben, I wanted to help sell your book. What can the reader take away from the land of enterprise? Because we really want people to be more capitalist. Because what I see from my, minimized point of view is we are raising more and more socialists and communists in an oversimplified form. What I mean by that, we have more and more people who expect the government to take care of them, be it, they're the Fed chairman who will be guaranteed a pension, the same as every senator, every congressman, every president is guaranteed a pension and medical care, but the poor don't get that. Right. And so, in my opinion, it's the academics who are employees like my poor dad who want all the benefits and suck it out of the taxpayers' pockets that are a large part of the problem. So that's why what can you tell them about the land of enterprise and what they should know?
Well, what I think the land of enterprise has to offer is a perspective that the critical sort of political fights throughout American history have just as often been between different types of business interests as they have been between some conception of the government or the people on one hand versus capitalists on the other.
That was a civil war.
Well, the Civil War was certainly part of it.
Slavery
preceding
versus
the Civil War, you
industrialization.
had. Yeah, and I think that's right. And I try to make a case that you can understand, if not agree with, the South's commitment to maintaining slavery when you see the economic value that enslaved people had to their owners, and the degree to which they represented a major capital asset. But even beyond the Civil War, you can see this as early as the first decade of the country's history, and debates between farmers who wanted free trade and northern industrialists who wanted protectionist tariffs in order to protect themselves from being outcompeted by British manufacturers. And we could go through the whole litany of American history and see many areas where the battles really aren't between the socialists and the capitalists as much as they are between different types of capitalists.
Yeah, personal self-interest.
And people who want to use the government to promote those interests.
To change, which is why your book, Lobbying America, they want to change the rules to favor their self-interest.
That's right. I mean, the Lobbying America book talks about a movement among major industrial CEOs in the 1970s to push back against the types of regulations that they believed hampered their ability to make money. And my argument is that it distracted them. This sort of political fight distracted them from actually adapting to a newer and more open, automated, and global trading environment. And as a result, they spent their energies pushing back against the EPA and OSHA,
for their own self-interest. And I'm going to jump into on something that here's a takeaway I think the readers will get, because I love your piece on advertising, the advertising of America. And you said the advertising business expanded through its ability to create a consumer need where one had not existed. And you talk about the story of Listerine.
That's
right. And Listerine was used for what? And what did they create? They created a disease called halitosis, bad breath.
That's right.
They put a name to it. It never existed before.
Well, it did exist. Right. They had
bad breath.
Sure, and people have had bad breath for as long as there's been people, I suppose. But yeah, this is in the 1920s. There's a company called the Lambert Pharmaceutical Company that teamed up with some professional advertisers to try to drum up sales for this product Listerine, which had been created as an antiseptic. It was used in surgeries. The notion that you'd put it in your mouth was sort of crazy. But yeah, I think the way this fits into the broader story is that this is a specific moment in the history of business when a direct consumer outreach becomes the new big thing, and the idea of creating need or creating demand for things where they hadn't been there before kind of came together with the ability to produce things en masse and distribute them widely and reduce the prices, and it has real cultural effects.
Well, as a reader, I look at this and I go, where is this happening today? This is happening all the time today. So it's kind of a bit of a wake-up call for people to say, hey, what's that? What are these advertisers doing? They're making up all these diseases. They've got a pill, so they're going to create a disease so they can sell their pill.
Once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Our special guest today is Benjamin Waterhouse. Fantastic book, The Land of Enterprise. I can't wait to read it because I am a capitalist, and I really don't like, the bureaucrats. What a bureaucrat does is they produce rules. They just make more and more rules to stop the capitalists like me from making more money. And I understand the checks and balances here. So a capitalist makes money, and a bureaucrats make rules. And we're now at the point where we're ready to shoot each other. And so that's why the Land of Enterprise is important, because I would like to encourage more people to be capitalists, because our school system, our academic system, produces bureaucrats, people who don't know how to make money but need a paycheck. As my complaint has always been, how come most politicians enter public service poor and wind up rich? There's something screwy within our system right now. So that's why Benjamin Waterhouse, The Land of Enterprise, it's a very important book for people to read. So Ben, final words. What do you want people to take away from your book, The Land of Enterprise?
I want to take away that the history of American business is wrapped up in the history of America, that you can't understand what the country is and why we care about the things that we care about, and why we do the things that we've done for good and for evil, right? Everything from promoting democracy to participating in slavery.
How about warfare? How about warfare?
Warfare as well, sure. And I think there's not an aspect of American cultural life or military life or political life that's not deeply wrapped up in the story of business.
And we're gonna go into the next segment, which is going to be about the future of business. Can you just wrap up in like 30 seconds what you see as the future of business?
Well, I think, the trends that Robert has described seem to be continuing. In the last 75 years, we've seen a major change in whether wealth is accruing to labor as it was in the mid-20th century, or wealth is more accruing to capital. And the trend at the moment is for wealth to continue to accrue to capital. The question is, what does that do for the increasing majority of people who aren't able to be capitalists for one reason or another? And the current trend is that they're going to be continually squeezed.
And that's that's concern of the Rich Dad Company, and that's why we have financial education. And our question always, why doesn't school teach us about money? One answer is, so you can listen to this program again, because when repetition is how you learn. And secondarily, if you have friends, family, or fellow idiots who need to learn more, then you should listen to this program and at least discuss it. Because what we're discussing is not only the future of other people's jobs, but we're also discussing the future of your job, and more importantly, who is running the world. Are we going to be a country where everybody expects the government to take care of them, and we have to pay everybody not to work, where work is considered an insult rather than an obligation or responsibility? So our next guest is Jason Schenker, and he's the president and chief economist of Prestige Economics. Now, not only is his title say who he is, but he is ranked by Bloomberg News as the #1 most accurate forecaster in the world on what's going on in the future. So we're going to be talking about the future, not only of your money and your job, but maybe your friends and your children's future of their job. Any comments, Kim?
Yes, and Jason's also the author of Jobs for Robots, Between Robocalypse and Robotopia, which was just out in February. So, Jason, welcome to our program.
Thanks for having me, Kim and Robert. It's great to be here.
Let's just get down to basics here. Suppose you're a parent, let's say you're 45 years old. You have a child that's, let's say, 15, and you look, as a parent, you look in the future. What would you say to your child about job security or whatever you talk about as a, parent to child?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that education doesn't stop, right? And this is something that we've already seen developing in recent years, but it's going to become a constant need going forward. People need to be adaptive. There's going to be change at a more rapid pace. And, some people have said, some analysts looking at the future, they've said that, well, we won't be able to keep up. And I think we will be able to keep up, but people need to be responsive. They need to be learning new skills. And, the education, if you're out there and you're working and you have a profession, it doesn't stop with high school or with college or with grad school. It's almost never going to be enough because the workforce is going to be changing in a very dynamic way in the future, more so than we've seen. But the good news is there's also going to be more education, formal and informal, that people have access to, more so than they've ever had in the past.
Amen. So that's why the Rich Dad Company was formed, because as most of our listeners know, I keep asking the question, why don't they teach us about money at school? And that's been my question. And, because
I have an answer for you, Robert.
They don't know what they're talking about.
Well, the thing is, if you're good at math and you're good at numbers and you look at the salary you can make as a teacher versus the salary you can make doing something else with numbers, the numbers don't add up. And so you could be a teacher, and so instead you go off and do something like, if you're an accountant, you can make a lot more than if you're a teacher, a financial planner, a wealth manager, investment banker. Those jobs pay a lot better. And if you're good at math, you do the math and you just don't go into the teaching, generally speaking. And that's why there's a low level of numeracy, a special financial numeracy, because you can't attract the talent that's going to be top-notch. But in the future, more online education is going to increase the access to people with real financial experience, because you're going to have a lot more online learning, reverse classrooms, and you're going to be able to access those real financial experts to help people have the financial education that they need in order to survive in a world where, under the current education system, they don't have that training.
And we're huge proponents of lifelong learning. That's what our company is all about. That's what we do. Jason, your book is called Jobs for Robots. Where are robots coming in? Where our jobs are leaving? What jobs are going to be sticking around?
Yeah, this is great. And this ties in exactly what you're talking about. Lifelong education is so important. The number one deciding factor as to whether a robot takes your job or not really depends on the level of education involved, right? There was a study that was out at the end of the Obama administration in December, that showed what the percentages looked like if you had a bachelor's degree. And essentially, if you have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, you're going to be pretty insulated from the robots. Whereas if you graduated from only high school, or if you didn't, you're going to be very, very exposed. Those are the biggest deciding factors. And to put the numbers in terms, right, if your job requires less than a high school diploma, right, there's a 44% chance that your job is highly automatable. 44%. If you have a bachelor's degree, it's 1%. That if that's a requirement for your job. So that's a huge difference. And if you have a graduate degree, it's essentially zero, right? And so that's really important. So if you have a job that's low skill, low education, you've got to move up that education value chain. You got to get more skills, more education. You need to be in that, that best use of your time. That's what's going to be important.
And where does the entrepreneur fit into this?
Well, for entrepreneurs, I think there's kind of a double-edged sword. And so for entrepreneurs, there are more opportunities. And with things like crowdfunding, there's an opportunity to access capital more than before. There's the opportunity to have virtual businesses unlike anything before. So, I know my business is largely virtual. This is true of a lot of other folks. Look, you can be number one in the world and be virtual, right? That's not a problem anymore. So I think those things are going to be positive. The challenge comes with, if there's no entitlements reform, you're going to have payroll taxes go up a lot. People talk about the national debt. U.S. national debt is $20 trillion. All the sovereign debt in the world is $60 trillion. But entitlements, which is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, could be up to $200 trillion. It's 10 times the size of the national debt. And it's financed by payroll taxes.
Jason,
and, of course, if you're self-employed, you pay that. Yes.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that, because that's you're singing from the same hymnal I went to church in. So Jason, let me ask you this question. Okay, so let's say I go to school, I get my PhD in accounting or in computer science, and I get a job with, let's say, Sears, and suddenly, what's his name, Amazon blows me out of the water, and I'm now 55 years old. But as I said earlier, both Kim and I, our fathers lost their jobs in mid-50s, and both of them were highly educated men, and they never recovered. You say, what do you say to that?
Well, you've got to remain adaptive. I mean, I have a cousin in his 60s. He just got a new job as a consultant. So, he'd been unemployed for a number of years, and, he got a nice six-figure gig. He just kept looking and was trying to still network and work through it. And, look, that doesn't mean it's the end of your career. And by the way, someone who was 55 20 years ago will have a very different experience than someone who's 55 now. There's a lot more consultants. There's also entrepreneurial opportunities, and you need to just keep building your skills. I mean, I've done in the past some consulting work that companies help them find executives, and they didn't care how old they were, right? They didn't care. They cared about their experience, and they cared about the period of, okay, they've been unemployed for a couple of years. What were they doing during those years? Were they sitting on the couch, eating Cheetos, or were they taking some online courses?
That's
were they
my
going
favorite
to conferences? Well, right, and it might be, but if that's all they're doing, they're unemployable. But if they were writing some LinkedIn articles, or they were going to a couple conferences, or they took some online courses that might even be free, then that was positive. Oh, okay, great. They're still engaged. Their mind is active. They're trying to build their skills, even though they can't do it in a job. Those things are positive. So I would tell someone who was, if you're 55 and you lose your job, move quickly. Don't stand still. Well, the reason and just always be moving.
You're a very positive man, Jason, and I appreciate that. The reason I'm laughing is my definition of consultant is somebody who's looking for a job. Anyway,
Jason, worked in consulting, I would just say that there's a certain truth to that. I mean, executive. I worked at McKinsey, and that's considered to be the top consulting firm. And I would tell you that even in that case, no one stays. Everyone goes somewhere else.
Right.
You're just trying to build your skills as a consultant and build your network.
And I think that's the message. So once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Our guest for this segment is Jason Schenker, and he's the president and chief economist of Prestige Economists. Here's the not the most important thing, but Bloomberg News rates him as the number one most accurate forecaster in the world. So that's why we have Jason on today, is because things are changing so rapidly that I already know I was obsolete a long time ago, but I just kept going into entrepreneurship versus looking for a job. What is happening to this thing called universal income, or whatever you call it, where everybody gets a paycheck from the taxpayer?
Everybody gets a basic income, and with all the jobs being lost, we're hearing a lot of pro reasons why this should happen. I know you have a take on it.
So the universal basic income idea is exactly that. Everybody gets a check from the government, whether they work or they don't work. And, there are four really big problems with this. And, the first is that if everyone gets a check that's worth half a Honda every year, how much do Hondas cost, or let alone a cup of coffee or anything else? If you start giving people all this free money, what happens to inflation? The second thing is taxation, right? Where's the money going to come from? And that leads to a third risk, which is you could, hurt business incentives, right? I mean, obviously, if taxes go up, you might lose companies, they might go away. And the fourth thing is, people are assuming by handing out money, you make people feel fulfilled. And a lot of people like to be busy, like to do stuff. I mean, y'all are very successful. I consider myself successful. I know a lot of other successful people, and yet they still work. They still do things. Why do they do it? Well, because they want to stay busy. And what happens if people have nothing to do? And even if they've got all the free money in the world, idle hands are the work of the devil, right? And this is, this isn't good. If you give everybody free money and they've got nothing to do, it's like Greek mythology, right? Why did, the Greek gods and goddesses are sitting on Mount Olympus, they got nothing to do, so they basically just destroy the world at different times. So,
well, that's a great point,
right?
because if people don't have a sense of purpose and they lose their spirit of drive, then that can be devastating to a country.
Well, anything else? I mean,
universal basic income also sounds, because some people, they like this idea and they think they've heard it before, and they have. It's Marxism, like pure and simple. And while Marxism was, workers of the world unite, universal basic income is non-workers of the world unite, and it's really bad and can
Who's
be
pushing
devastating
it?
for society.
Who's pushing it? Who wants it?
People are pushing for it who already have kind of a directional agenda politically towards that. And of course, when you rob Peter to pay Paul, you can always count on Paul's vote. And in this case,
yes, and isn't it right? Well, isn't it like
it's easy? We'll just take the money from the robots, and we'll give it to the people. But there's investment decisions and technology benefits and companies and people who work at those companies that are behind those robot developments. And so and so there's some of that, and then there's also some of the folks who might be benefiting significantly from the robotic revolution and the move into the automation age. They might be trying to, kind of hedge their bets by also pushing for this in the background.
Well, I think your recommendations are, I would say, sound and astute for this era of time. Your idea of staying busy even though unemployed while you're a consultant looking for your next job is really kind of a good idea because I'm not pessimistic. I'm just kind of wondering what's going to happen in the near future. So let me ask this last question on this. And, we're not Republican or Democrat and all this. What was your take on the run between Hillary and Mr. Trump?
In 2012, more people voted for American Idol than voted for the presidential election. Okay,
that's sad.
Rolling into 2016, right? And people are looking at Trump and Hillary, and the other thing you have to remember is, Reagan and Kennedy beat Nixon because he looked better on TV. Right, Reagan had this also kind of TV background, and he had built his career on Bedtime for Bonzo, a movie about him with a chimpanzee, right? And You're Fired is way cooler than Bedtime for Bonzo. And so to me, it doesn't surprise me that this shook out this way. I'm not surprised.
But my question was, there was an underlying trend under Trump versus Hillary. She's trying to, I don't know what, somebody says she was not liked, or, I didn't really care. But was Trump more likable, even though he's obnoxious as he was, with some of the things he said about, race, women, and religion?
Yeah, I think in some ways he was viewed as more likable, somebody you'd want to sit down with a beer with or have a conversation with. And I think that's a real thing. I think there was also some frustration with the, kind of the same old, and people like the change up sometimes, even if it's a different change up and they, let's just try something different. But I think the most important thing is that from a battle plan standpoint, when these candidates go in, it's all between Ohio and Florida. Like, that's the whole game, right? The last president to win as a Republican and not get Florida, you got to go back into the 20s, right? This is, that's a real deal. And that matters a lot. If you look at something like Ohio, that matters even more. For Ohio, the last Republican to win without winning Ohio was no one ever, right? So, if Calvin Coolidge is the last one to win, without getting Florida in 1924, and no Republicans ever won Ohio, those two states are must-haves. And then, of course, there's other states too. And so I think part of the Clinton plan was to build deeper inroads for the Democratic Party into some states, and some of those core need-to-win, must-win states didn't get enough attention to also be taken.
So, final word, what does that mean to the people? What does that mean? What do you think the voters were saying?
Well, they want to change, but that's what they also said when they voted for Obama in a certain way. People just like the idea of change in some respects, and that tends to be a message that resonates with voters who, after a certain number of years, they're disappointed with whoever the politicians are in power, and this is a pretty, kind of normal thing. The second thing I'd say is that there's I guess as I look forward, I'm a bit concerned because when you have a lot of optimism, there's an equation that people also don't teach, which they should teach, but it's very important. Expectations minus reality equals disappointment. And right?
That's what I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
With Obama, there was, expectations minus reality equals disappointment. And I think right now you have very high expectations being reflected in the equity markets, very high expectations of corporate tax cuts, of increased spending. These are tough things to do when you've got $20 trillion in debt and $200 trillion in entitlements off balance sheet. How do you spend this money? How do you cut these taxes? And if those things don't come to fruition, and expectations minus reality equals disappointment, there's going to be a gap there, and there could be some backlash. So I think that's the most important thing to be watching now is, what can President Trump deliver on, especially economically and fiscally? Because at the end of the day, that's a really important thing that people are going to vote on.
Well, Jason, I really want to thank you for your optimism, but also your forthrightness. Please get his book, Ask Robert, and you can submit your questions to Ask Robert at the Rich Dad Radio Show. Any comments, Kim, before we go on?
No, I think it was fascinating, and I really do want to recommend both of these books because we are talking about the past of the history of American capital, the history of global capitalism, really, and the future. So, I mean, things are changing so well. Jason said it, you got to be a lifelong learner today. You got to be flexible. If you're counting on a job, which, of course, we're not, and I still think entrepreneurship is the best way to go, especially in this time. So,
Melissa, what's the first question for Ask Robert?
Our first question today comes from Luis in California. Favorite book, Cashflow Quadrant. It says, Robert, let's say that a lot of jobs will be wiped out by AI or robots. Although this may be true, wouldn't it just mean that old-timers like yourself that
old-timers. How
I
rude is
know.
that?
This is Luis saying this here. He says, wouldn't that mean that people like yourself that aren't as familiar with technology will be the most affected as opposed to the younger working class that is tech savvier?
You may not like my answer, but it's Donald Trump's answer. You're fired. You see, the difference is I'm an entrepreneur. I can hire and fire guys like you. And you don't know anything about what it takes to be an entrepreneur. One of the great things about the Rich Dad Company, our tech-savvy genius, Shane Caniglia, is training all the techies like you to be entrepreneurs, not to be working-class guys. So my little sweetheart friend, I'd fire you immediately because if I lose my job, so are you fired. Any comments?
That's pretty good. That just goes to my case. It's all about being an entrepreneur. I think that's the way to go. And I love what Shane is doing here at our company. And people oftentimes go, oh, how can you teach people to be entrepreneurs? They're going to all quit. Well, no, they're not quitting. They have part-time jobs and they're building businesses and they're investing because if we don't practice what we preach, then we're just a charlatan. So that's what we do here.
So I'm afraid that comment about old-timers, you're a young timer who will be unemployed. That's the challenge for you. So I would be careful on your point of view. If you like the cash flow quadrant, you're coming from an employee's mentality, not an I quadrant mentality. And just remember, guys like me can hire and fire some very smart people. So before we go on in this whole thing, is why Kim and I are entrepreneurs is both our dads lost their jobs. And both men never recovered. Never. And mid-career, they're in their 50s. So all of you out there say, I don't know, are my job secure and all this. I want you to understand that's what drives Kim and I to be entrepreneurs. But more importantly, what it does to the family. My mother died 4 months after my dad lost his job. She could not take it. She could not take not having money, the loss. He ran for lieutenant governor of the state of Hawaii, in the most corrupt state in the whole union. When she lost the friendship of her friends who were also all corrupt, she died of a heart attack. Now, Kim's mom at least rolled along with it, right?
Yeah. The thing I realized when my dad got fired, he was in his early 50s. I realized right away there was no such thing as job security. And I was not ever going to put myself in a position where I could be fired, where my whole life could be upended just because somebody decides to fire me. I was never going to give anybody that control. So I became an entrepreneur at that moment.
So all of you sweethearts out there who think that we're old guys, we control the paychecks. And if you don't control the paychecks of other people, you're an employee and you're about to get fired no matter what happens. So that's why we do our talks and all those things. That's why there's Rich Dad Radio. That's why we have financial education programs like Rich Dad's Education, Rich Dad's Coaching, online programs. And it's exactly as Jason says, it's lifelong learning. So that guy who's very arrogant saying, I'm a techie, you're the most susceptible because technology is changing every 18 months. Today, you're obsolete every 18 months. So Kim and I on real estate is going to be around a couple of thousand more years. You know, I don't know if you're going to live in a glass bubble or whatever you're going to live in, but you still have to have real estate. You still have to oil, water, gas, food, and all this. So start thinking like an entrepreneur, not like an employee who thinks I have job security. I think that is the most stupid thing I've heard all program long. There is no job security today, given how fast things are changing.
Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Ikiwe in Nigeria. Favorite book, Unfair Advantage. With the ongoing global economic recession, what do you think would be an investor or a business owner's position if the money system fails?
It's already failed for most people, and especially if you're coming from Nigeria. I'm reading this article right now about Marine Le Pen, who was running for office in France. France is very liberal. There are more Muslims and minorities in France, but they're in a class system. They don't let them in and out. So it says here, on a rainy morning, women spread old shoes, screwdrivers, and cell phones on mats in a train station, hoping to sell something. The men just stand on corners doing nothing. So that's what the future looks like for many of you who need a job. The other guy says, my son drifts around projects selling drugs. He says it's the only business that works. So for all of you out there who are listening to this, Rich Dad really stands for entrepreneurship and the idea that you should never need a paycheck again. And the question I ask all of you, what would it take to be that you never need a paycheck again? So you